Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to your morning briefing for Friday, the 2nd of May, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Let's go ahead and jump into Inside the Beltway. Robert, good morning. Let's start with these TCOs, these transnational criminal organizations. Trump wants to label them now as enemy combatants. What's going on?
Good morning, Mike. So this is coming from people that say they're familiar with the White House deliberations, and they're saying that Trump is considering labeling members of transnational criminal organizations, specifically those designated as foreign terrorists. That includes MS-13, Tren de Aragua, and the Sinaloa cartel, and some of these other cartels, both in the U.S. and abroad, as enemy combatants. And the idea is to speed up deportation operations. And some officials have said that they're looking for basically a way to get around the district courts blocking deportations.
Mm-hmm. All right. Kind of on that topic, the Trump administration released an executive order earlier this week, and we talked about on yesterday's show, that they're looking for these quote-unquote excess assets. They're looking for military under the DOD and then under the DOJ excess assets to be used for domestic policing. Now we're seeing this first $1 trillion defense budget being proposed. The two seem to be linked. Let's start with this defense budget, Robert.
So President Trump is expected to send what's called the skinny budget proposal. That's just a very basic skeleton of a budget proposal to Congress today. And administration officials said that it's going to cut non-defense spending by 23%, increase defense spending for the first time to over $1 trillion. And like you said, I think this is tied into that executive order, looking at all these parts put together, this national security asset order, the consideration of enemy combat designation, plus this $1 trillion budget. I think Trump looks to be leaning on the military as a more reliable tool for domestic security, including immigration enforcement. So I think I also saw that comment from Tom Homan. So I think there, where we could see something big on the horizon as far as rounding up some of these TCO members and enforcement against these sanctuary city and state officials.
Mm-hmm. Here's the thing with Tom Homan. For weeks now, he's been promising. Actually, it's months ago. He said, well, the aperture is about to. He was asked why the numbers of deportations have been so relatively low. And he said, oh, the aperture is about to expand. And I'm not sure that the aperture has actually expanded all that much. Maybe he's right. Maybe, what did he say? Something, he said something about the summer. I forget. Wait until you see what happens next or something like that. That's what he told a reporter earlier this week. All right. On this topic of the executive order, where President Trump is requesting the Defense Department to find these excess assets. So this could be military personnel, could be military equipment and assets, could be military training for law enforcement. It really does seem like the Trump administration is getting ready to go into these cities and start enforcing the laws that mayors and police chiefs have not. And this is the problem. You talked about the military being a more reliable entity. The problem is in these big cities, these police chiefs are beholden to the mayor. And if the mayor doesn't want certain laws enforced, then the police chief just doesn't enforce them, like illegal immigration. That's why we get these sanctuary cities. And this comment by Tom Homan, at least to me, implied that the Trump administration is about to go after these sanctuary cities. Is that the read you're getting, Robert?
Yeah, and that, because this is also something else the Trump administration has done, is they stood up that sanctuary cities working group. And the idea was to civilly and criminally charge these state and local level officials if they tried to obstruct immigration enforcement. We've already seen one of those arrests happen with that Wisconsin judge. So that we could see, I think what Tom Homan is hinting at is something like that, like sending a more politically reliable entity in to conduct immigration enforcement and effectively use criminal law that they have put, that Trump has directed the DOJ to conduct to get these sanctuary city and state officials either to start cooperating or go to jail.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, what happens when some federal judge from, Kansas says, oh, the federal government can't do this? I mean, that's the next step, right?
Yeah. And like I think I said before, I think Trump is defying the courts. He's not coming out and just declaring it, but he this appears to be doing it on, at least on immigration.
Mm-hmm. All right. On a similar topic, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth is now ordering a total Army restructure. Just how total is this?
Well, he's calling it, or he's asking the Secretary of the Army to implement what he's calling a comprehensive transformation strategy. And it's going to consolidate and eliminate some formations in the Army and the Reserve and National Guard. And the idea is he wants to create a more flexible force to deter China and rapidly respond to threats directly to the United States homeland. But one thing that stood out to me was that he wants to push advanced manufacturing down to operational units by next year, and also modernize what he called the organic defense industrial base, which is, I took that to mean industry that is owned by the U.S. military, that is operated by contractors. So that is things like the Lake City plant, where they manufacture small arms ammunition, but it's ran by a rotating contractor, but is owned by the Army. So to me, this looks like to be a focus on, I think he specifically said things like advanced 3D printing and pushing down the ability for units to manufacture things like drones and on demand, and to create more flexible combined arms units.
Mm-hmm. Have we seen any details? You say, I guess some units may be being downsized or going away, maybe some certain vehicles downsized, going away, replaced with something else. Have we seen any details yet?
Yeah, they're talking about they want to eliminate the purchase of certain legacy vehicles, light vehicles. And they're also canceling what's called the M10 Booker light tank, which was there used to be this doctrine in the U.S. Army during the Cold War of using airdrop light tanks, and the Biden administration tried to bring that back, and it ran into some trouble. So he's also eliminating that program. And I think what they're looking to do is take lessons learned from the Russia-Ukraine war, especially the use of micro drones, and apply that to the U.S. Army.
Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully the Army we have when we go to war is much closer to the Army than we want, than the Army we have, as the famous Rumsfeld comment goes. All right, let's move on here. There was a hearing in Congress yesterday, I believe, talking about how drones are exploiting. We've seen a lot of reports about drones, unknown drones, hovering over military installations, sensitive military sites. I guess some details that were released yesterday in this hearing, Robert.
Yeah, this is from the deputy or the vice operations director from the Joint Chiefs. His name's Rear Admiral Paul Spadero. During this hearing, he pointed out that there are these jurisdictional gaps that exist on counter-drone authorities, and he said they're creating what he called safe zones for foreign intelligence operations, and that foreign adversaries are exploiting these gaps to conduct surveillance and disrupt operations of U.S. military installations. And some of the lawmakers in this hearing also pointed out that transnational criminal organizations are also doing this. They're leveraging weak U.S. drone defenses to conduct surveillance and reconnaissance along the southern border, including over some military installations and some of these national defense zones that have been recently established. And part of the reason why these gaps exist is because there's no single federal agency that has overall counter-drone authorities. And not only are they exploiting the lack of these counter-drone authorities, they're also exploiting jurisdictional boundaries. So basically, they're conducting surveillance from outside of the airspace of these installations, where state and local authorities would have jurisdiction but might not have the capability or legal authority to actually shoot down these drones. There were some proposals on how to fix this, mostly legislation that lawmakers say they're going to try to close these gaps by expanding the authority of installation commanders to shoot down these drones and increase coordination with state civilian authorities.
Mm-hmm. That seems to be a huge sticking point. You know what this reminds me of also, Robert, is my Iraq tour was 0809, and there was a vehicle-borne IED, we call it VBED. There was a VBED cell operating in the west part of Baghdad. And this is exactly what was happening. His name was Sheikh Ubaidi. And he would launch these VBED attacks in one unit's battle space. But he lived actually in Anbar province. And so the guys in Baghdad, they're searching for this VBED cell, and they couldn't find him anywhere. And it's because he was operating over with the Marines. He was targeting the Army, but he was in the Marine Corps battle space, and he really exploited the lack of crosstalk there between the Army and the Marine Corps. And you look at that and you say, well, no wonder he was able to do this for so long. They were looking for him in the wrong place. And it kind of sounds like that's what these drone guys are doing.
Yeah, and they also pointed out another concern, a major concern, is that they're worried about the future of AI-enhanced drones, and specifically autonomous navigation and potential weaponization, something that we have seen also in Russia and Ukraine, where a lot of these micro drones have been weaponized, like the Shahed, the Switchblade, which is a U.S. manufactured drone. And then some of the drones that the cartels use, as far as I understand, could already be given this capability. As far as I understand, they're similar to the DJI drones used in that conflict, where you can go on, I think it's Temu or Alibaba, and maybe even Amazon, and buy attachments where you can attach mortar shells and hand grenades to these drones that could be dropped on top of targets.
Yes, you can. We were dropping water bottles when we were testing this out. From a little DJI drone. So yeah, it's possible. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on to our roll-ups, and we're going to fly through these. A couple of things here. So CVS had an earnings call report this week, and they said that they may be leaving the state of Arkansas. And the executives on the call said that there's a bill in Arkansas, HB 1150, which was recently passed, turned into law. And that restricts pharmacy benefit managers from owning pharmacies. And so effectively what it does is it's trying to cut out the middleman here between the pharmaceutical companies and the and customers. And so at any rate, they said this law, it not only passed in Arkansas, but it's also going through various state houses in other states. They may be leaving those states. I'm not sure how serious they are, if this is just a threat to maybe try to get some clawbacks on the bill. I don't know. But they said that CVS, this could affect their 23 locations in the state of Arkansas. This is unbelievable. They said they have 300,000 customers and more than 4 million prescriptions. And you do the math, that's over 13 prescriptions per customer. And that's just in the state of Arkansas. 13 prescriptions per customer, according to CVS. Also, CVS, we're the most medicated society on earth in history. At any rate, CVS said they're also leaving the Affordable Care Exchanges, the Obamacare exchanges, due to persistent unprofitability. They said that CVS is going to lose $350 to $400 million this year alone. All right, and then moving on, Robert, I think this is yours. This bipartisan bill to strengthen U.S. grids. What's going on?
So this was a bipartisan bill introduced in the Senate yesterday, and it's called the Preventing Power Outages Act. As far as I could find, this bill is going to reauthorize some Energy Department grant programs, and the idea is to help states and utilities upgrade electrical grid infrastructure. This has been introduced by Gary Peters, who's a Michigan Democrat, and Bill Cassidy, who's a Republican senator from Louisiana. And they said this bill is also going to update these grant programs, and the idea is to find where this money would actually be most useful, basically to go to states with the least reliable grids.
All right, and then this de minimis loophole closing today. RIP Temu?
Yeah, exactly. Basically, this is the order, President Trump's order ending these de minimis tariff exemptions are going to go into effect today. So this removes exemptions for any packages lower than $800 in value. So packages from China, Hong Kong are going to be taxed at about 120% of their stated value, or a flat rate of $100, which, as far as I understand, is if it's less than $100 in value, then obviously it's going to be taxed at that flat rate rather than the percentage, whichever one ends up being higher. But then that flat rate fee is going to double on the 1st of June to $200. So this is going to have a major effect on people who are doing shopping through these things like Temu, Shine, and these other Chinese shipping, basically equivalents of Amazon.
All right. And then we've seen a lot of pictures and a lot of news coming out of these West Coast ports, and it is a problem. Some of these ports are ghost towns, and now what these port operators are trying to lobby members of Congress.
Yeah, there was a phone call apparently between officials at the Long Beach port and the Seattle port, and they were asking senators from the West Coast to reverse Trump's tariffs after a surge in shipping cancellations have hit these ports. They're now, I think, in this quarter so far, saying that the 34 inbound ships have been canceled. And the Port of Long Beach CEO Mario Cordero said that this was due to radical uncertainty. I think part of this is something we've seen a lot from the private sector, is uncertainty over tariffs. And I think part of this uncertainty is not necessarily that the tariffs are going to radically change, back and forth. I think they're concerned more about what happens after Trump leaves office. If we see a Democratic administration in 2029 where they would roll back these tariffs, and they don't want to put in the capital expenditures for domestic manufacturing if they're going to basically get rug pulled in 2029.
All right. Thanks for that. Let's bring Jared on. And Jared, I'll just let you take it from the top.
Sounds good. Pakistan is reportedly reinforcing its border even more in the Kashmir region. They're going to be using, quote, air defense assets, electronic warfare troops, howitzers, and additional infantry. And that sounds largely defensive in nature to me. So I think they're preparing for the Indian incursion they've been warning about all week. The Israeli prime minister said yesterday that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, conducted an airstrike near the Syrian presidential palace in Damascus yesterday. And they did this as a message to Syria not to threaten the Druze. I think the main concern here is that Turkey is still operating very deeply in the region. And I haven't seen whether or not there's collateral damage yet, but the more action you take inside of Syria, the more likely I think it is that we could see some accidental crossover there. China's Ministry of Commerce also told reporters this morning that China would be willing to enter tariff and trade negotiations with the United States if the United States was prepared to take action on issues such as correcting its wrong practices and canceling unilateral tariffs. So basically, hey, you do exactly what we want, and then we'll come to the table. They carried on saying that failing to do so would show, quote, the U.S. has no sincerity at all and will further damage the mutual trust between the two sides. A lot of people are taking the initial part of the statement saying that they're evaluating the situation as, China may be coming to the table. I don't think that's happening at all, because it's predicated on the U.S. cutting off tariffs. In moving over to France and Africa, France's foreign minister said in an interview yesterday that France, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the United States are working together to stop the humanitarian crisis in the Eastern Congo there. And a couple months ago, we talked about the Democratic Republic of the Congo coming to the United States to ask for security assistance in exchange for securing the critical minerals there and helping break China's control on it. I think this is actually a very quiet follow-up to it, and shows that the U.S. and France are both trying to they're both trying to secure these minerals and break China's control here. And lastly, the Coast Guard authorized full production of its prospective polar security cutter yesterday. Now, this authorization will allow the shipyard to accelerate hiring and deliver as quickly as possible per the announcement. I didn't see any delivery date. Normally these are a couple years out, but I think the fact that they are saying you're going to hire more people, we need this as quickly as possible, and it's the Arctic, which we've been covering extensively here. I think they're trying to move this timeline leftward, so get it here quicker than what has previously been ordered.
All right, quick question. What is a cutter? What is the significance of that?
All Coast Guard ships are called cutters.
Oh, okay.
It's basically just not calling it a ship.
Okay, fair enough. All right. Thanks, Jared. Let's move on here. ICE, I think this happened on Wednesday. Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, in the U.S. Secret Service raided a home of a California man who was accused of doxing ICE and Homeland Security Investigations agents. The suspect has not been named, but he was accused of distributing these flyers. There's one shown here on your screen that show the names and faces of these HSI officers, and he was doing as a warning to illegal immigrants in his Irvine, California neighborhood. Agents did not arrest the guy. Apparently, he lived at home with his parents. No arrests were made, but they did have a search warrant for his home. Activists are saying this is a violation of the First Amendment And this man has a constitutional right to post, I guess, legal information about law enforcement officers. ICE says this is a matter of officer safety. I'm guessing that's why he was not arrested, because this probably is protected under the First Amendment. Moving on here. To Kraft and Heinz. There was an earnings call this week. Kraft Heinz, they are the 6th largest food producer in the world. And they said that their cost of goods sold is forecast to increase by 5% this year. That's up from a previous forecast of 3%. And they said this forecast does not include any of the impact from tariffs. Executives say they so far have no plans to further increase prices, and it implies to me, at least, that the company is currently looking to absorb these costs rather than passing them on to the consumer. One thing a lot of these companies did, and you could see this through the trade data, a lot, not just food retailers, but lots of companies did this. They ramped up purchases in the first quarter of this year in expectations of the tariffs. And so a lot of these companies are sitting on lower cost inventories. That's probably a reason why we're not going to see a lot of price increases in the near term. However, Kraft executives did say that their profit margins would hit low points in the second quarter of this year. So that runs from April to June. And that most of these impacts will be felt in the second half of this year. And that suggests to me, at least, the prices could rise later in this year if tariffs remain in place or if these trade deals are not worked out. Point being, it's another sign to me that inflation's going to start ticking up, and definitely in the second half of this year could become problematic, as they say. Moving on. All right, Jared, there was or maybe this was Robert. There was another hearing yesterday talking about what Chinese defense industrial base, or what was going on.
Yeah, this was a House hearing on what they called the American Industrial Renaissance. One of the witnesses, he's the CEO of an automated factory builder called Hadrian. His name's Chris Power. And during this hearing, he said that the consolidation of the defense industry, and this is the post-80s consolidation of all of these smaller contractors down into a handful of what are called prime contractors. He said this has created an unsustainable situation for the U.S. Basically, supply chains are fragile and defense production expertise has dwindled. And he says this has allowed China to become the sole production superpower. And China outproduces the United States by roughly 3 times. And this is not, he and other witnesses at this hearing pointed out something that is pretty well known that we've talked about now, that U.S. deindustrialization, including the defense industrial base, was a deliberate policy decision. And they say that was to trade short-term efficiency by offshoring production for long-term production capacity, as we can see now. And this has had a significant impact on the defense industry as our production capacity has waned. However, he did make a critical point that the remaining post-consolidation defense contractors are taking federal dollars from these contracts and spending them at Chinese factories. So this creates a key defense supply chain vulnerability. Basically, China can cut off these defense inputs in the event of a crisis or conflict between the U.S. and China.
Yeah, I guess my big question, we've been talking about this for years now. My question is, have they, I guess they have one option. They could just stop selling us these inputs to wreck our defense production. But instead of cutting them off wholly, why couldn't you just engineer quality issues or slow down production? And that way you're not totally breaking the status quo, but you are actually reducing U.S. readiness. Did they say anything about the quality of these items coming out of China?
I didn't see anything from these witnesses about the quality of the items. The focus was really on reshoring supply chains, but that is another concern, not just for defense industry, but civilian production for consumer goods. There has been a lower quality. There's been a introduction of harmful substances. So like a lot of products that come from China have lead in them, like certain glass products. And that is another potential vulnerability is, sending over lower quality defense inputs. That was something we saw with the civilian airliner industry. I think we reported on it in 2023. There was the beginnings of a lawsuit in Europe over engine parts, and basically the middlemen for these engine parts and these other plane parts were forging airworthiness certificates for these parts that were made in China. So then those lower quality parts were able to make their way through U.S. and European airline supply chains. So now we're not exactly sure how many of these effectively fake parts have made their way onto U.S. and European airliners, and that's a long-term issue that the airliners and plane manufacturers are still dealing with now.
Mm-hmm. You know, there was that video. Someone ordered rebar from China, and rebar is put in concrete to hold. It's a structural thing for concrete, and the rebar is made out of plastic. Like, it was just solid plastic. It wasn't even steel. So, yeah, I don't know, Robert. It seems to me like this should be a winning message, frankly, for the Trump administration. You just point out all the cases where China has produced subpar components, and you say, do you want this going in your vehicle? Do you want this going in your airplanes? Do you want this going in our national defense components? And if the answer is no, then you have to support us on what we're trying to do with China, because we're trying to fix that problem. And this is, I was just on a podcast yesterday, and that's one of the things we talked about. The messaging failure. The Trump administration is just not making the case, I don't think, on this stuff. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's move on here. Speaking of China, we'll stay on the topic. Jared, I'm wondering how a Western or a U.S.-based polling company got access to have this poll in China. Apparently they did it online, but what did they find out?
Yes. So a couple of very interesting statements. 55% of the Chinese surveyed agreed that the Taiwan problem should not be resolved using force under any circumstances, which basically saying that there's not public support for moving militarily on Taiwan. And at the same time, 36% believe that China should militarily intervene if Japan changes its constitution to allow for offensive military action. Not even saying that Japan is taking them, but simply, attack Japan if they allow themselves to act like a proper nation again. And 26% believe that China should militarily intervene if South Korea merely pursues nuclear weapons. At the same time, 80% are okay with enforcing their claims on the China-India border, even if it leads to conflict. So they're not opposed to using the military in the survey. They're just opposed to using it in Taiwan, which I find incredibly interesting. Because most of those do not rise normally to the level of we need to step in, but here you have a significant plurality. Now, I think this partly comes from the narrative that China uses for reunification, where they say these are Chinese, we have to reunite with them, but that's driving sentiment away from forceful reunification. They want peaceful reunification. The problem with that is you can't have peaceful reunification without due to the fact that Taiwan is rapidly viewing itself as distinct from Chinese. You cannot achieve peaceful reunification without the threat of forceful reunification. So I think China's going to have to ramp up their messaging, otherize Taiwan, which is going to inflame all kinds of tensions in the region and probably drive militarization, frankly, drive militarization in South Korea and Japan in the order that we just talked about.
Mm-hmm. All right. So more of the status quo there. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. And let's go ahead and move on to some questions for today. All right. So if the Trump administration labels these groups as some of these illegals, I guess, as transnational criminal organizations, it sort of makes it open season on them, doesn't it? Yeah. I mean, I think this would greatly expand the options the Trump administration has to go after these folks. I mean, we're not just talking about DHS or HSI. We're talking about U.S. Secret Service or marshals or, whomever now going after military, maybe going after TCOs, and there was that executive order that was passed under Biden last year, and it did not get a lot of coverage, but we covered this one part did not get a lot of coverage, but we covered it and it was about using Title 50 domestically. So using clandestine or covert military assets domestically. And it talked about specifically on border security. I guess we could see maybe Title 50 operations in some capacity against TCOs domestically. Robert?
Yeah, that's a possibility, especially considering that executive order on the national security assets. I think most likely what we would see would be abroad military like strikes, covert actions. As far as I understand, there's already, since the beginning of the Trump administration, covert assets being used for surveillance abroad on these cartels that have been designated foreign terrorist organizations. But domestically, I think the idea is to speed up the detention process, the arrests of members of Trinidad Agua, MS-13, Sinaloa, and try to get around the district courts being able to put these nationwide injunctions on the arrests, so they can send them to detention centers, including Guantanamo Bay. This was basically the same process that the Bush administration used for Islamist organizations.
Mm. Well, yeah, I was about to say that labeling them as TCOs probably opens up a whole wide array of national security uses. And some of those, under the Bush administration, there were those secret court rulings where you have these secret judges making these rulings that the Bush administration could do this, basically like the Constitution didn't even exist. I don't know, slightly reminiscent, I guess. All right. There's another question here. Would you expand a little bit on the implications of TCOs being labeled enemy combatants? Sorry, that's what we're talking about here. TCOs being labeled enemy combatants. Generally, what range of actions might we see against these people? I think we already talked about it. If they're enemy combatants on U.S. soil, I think that is obviously a NORTHCOM and a military national defense issue. I'm not sure at what level the CIA could get involved domestically. That's typically under the purview of the FBI, domestic security operations. Robert, any other ideas?
I think the range of options is going to depend on geography. Inside of the United States, it's probably going to look more like arrests, detention, sent to black sites. Outside of the United States, we could see strikes, covert actions taken against some of the members here, like a high value target, snatch and grab of a leader of one of these organizations, or strikes on production facilities for fentanyl and things like that.
Mm-hmm. All right. Some Sicario stuff going down. All right. Gordon Chang and others are reporting that China is buckling by quietly acquiescing in the tariff war while maintaining their public bluster to save face. Are you hearing / seeing this? I have seen data coming out of China, a drop in shipping and trucking in production. And I think actually some of these factories are having layoffs now. It was one of the big logistics guys talking about this. I forget which one. But yes, that is biting into Chinese production. Robert or Jared, I've seen a lot of talk about how President Trump needs to create an off-ramp, an opportunity for China to save face if they want this to end. I think there's a certain level where maybe the Trump administration does not actually want this to end anytime soon. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said last month, he told Tucker Carlson that the Chinese economy was in a recession / deflationary depression. He said they're trying to export their way out of it. He said, quote, "We can't let them do that." Kind of sounds like to me that this is probably going to be a months-long problem, not a days-long problem. And I really do. I think the Trump administration wants to hurt China here. I think they actually do want to do that. And so maybe this is one reason why the Trump administration has not given China an off-ramp yet, even though I guess maybe they're talking about it. What say you?
I think the key Trump official to pay attention to is Bessent. There's a lot of coverage of Trump's comments on the tariffs and a lot of hay made about Trump's changing stances on what the tariffs are for daily. But I think the important person to pay attention to is Bessent. And I agree. I think that he wants to hurt China here. And that's why he is saying that China needs to come to the table to de-escalate this trade war. Because so far, everything he's said points to this being a deliberate strategy to cut Chinese exports off globally, to push our trade partners to also put tariffs on Chinese goods. And I think they're also motivated to do that, because something I started seeing basically since Trump took office is that there have been murmurs from these foreign trade partners, companies there, and their government's worried about getting Chinese goods dumped on their economy. And I think that's I think what's going on here is a competing narrative between Chinese officials and the Trump administration, both trying to say that the other is coming to them. But I don't think the Trump administration, specifically Scott Bessent, is motivated to go to China, because if they come to the U.S. and work out a deal that still fulfills Bessent's strategic goals, but if they don't, then he can just push forward with this Chinese economic containment strategy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this really looks like if you look at China's military expansion, their ability to use military action against Taiwan, to continue expanding their footprint in the South China Sea, to continuing to threaten the first island chain, and then looking at threatening the second island chain. You look at the center of gravity and all that is the Chinese economy. If the Trump administration is able to keep their boot on the neck of the Chinese economy, and I say that, and that's a little hyperbole there, but if he is able to further weaken, induce economic pain in China, then China will not have extra money to spend on their military. They will not have U.S. dollars pouring into their country that they can turn around and finance the growth of the military. That's been the problem for the past 30 years, is that us buying cheap Chinese crap has just financed the rise of China. So it really does seem like the center of gravity is the Chinese economy. And if you can put pressure on the Chinese economy, then you have a huge range of a big part of defense doctrine for the past decade, especially on China and other places, is inducing a strategic dilemma where you force your adversary to make a painful decision. Either decision they make is going to induce some extra pain. It really looks like we are trying to put China into a strategic dilemma. It seems like we're doing a good job. I don't know how much longer this can happen. I mean, we hear from Kraft saying basically, second half of the year is going to be a much different story economically in terms of inflation from the first half of the year. And then of course, the administration has midterms coming up in a year and a half. So I don't know, Jared, what were you going to say?
Well, I was going to bring up exactly what you were just saying, but also keeping in mind the larger picture of up until really, I think Forward Observer and Early Warning started talking about it here. Everybody was saying, war in 2027. We got 2 years to try to turn this ship around. That's hard. There's a lot of a lot of stuff that needs to fall into place. So the best thing that you could do is just push that timeline back. If they don't have the funding to actually wage a war, or they can't build up a stock, then that timeline looks a lot less capable, especially when you take into account that their timeline is military readiness. They don't even have the economic readiness to achieve military readiness to prepare to do it. Cool. Push the whole thing back. And at that point, you start hitting major deadlines for the U.S. military and the European militaries, where you get major weapon systems coming online, along with the industrial capacity moving back, which will further push back that timeline. And I believe it's the Thucydides trap that you cite frequently. The 70% of rising powers fight. If you want to achieve make America great again, you have to try to hit that 30% that doesn't fight. If you push China into the 2030s, they have a much harder time being able to fight at all due to their collapsing demographics. And then you avoid the Thucydides trap.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, history shows the Thucydides trap says 70% of the time revisionist power challenges a status quo power, results in war. Dale Copeland in his book, Economic Interdependence and War, says 90% of the time in the modern era, 90% of the time that future trade expectations turn negative between economically interdependent great powers. 90% of the time results in war. I mean, those are not great stats here if you're trying to avoid war. One other question here from Ben: the alternative market the size of the United States does not exist. Where would China send all their stuff? I mean, I think this is fundamentally the problem that Europe has. They don't really like dealing with Trump, but they definitely don't want China dumping Chinese products into European countries, flattening their own industries. And so you're right, there is no replacement for the American consumer. You know what this reminds me of is Colonel John Boyd, and his definition of grand strategy. And he said, in grand strategy, what you want to do is connect yourself to as many power centers and lines of support as possible, while simultaneously removing connections for your opponent from as many power centers and lines of support as possible. And I think if Trump does have a grand strategy, especially on the geoeconomic front, it is hammering out these deals, and whether, I don't know how beneficial they'll be, but this is what, this is the Trump bluster. Go out and get these big, beautiful deals, connect yourself to as many friendly allied coalition countries as possible, while simultaneously disconnecting China from as many U.S. friendly allied coalition countries as possible. And so it really seems like this is what he's doing. I don't know how successful it's going to be, but it does look like he is pursuing John Boyd's grand strategy here. Any other comments, Jared or Robert?
Yes. So what I've seen is there are concerns with all these countries we're negotiating with that China's going to send all their stuff to them. So it's not just Europe, it's also Asia, Malaysia, Singapore, Korea. And I think to me, that is an indicator that I think Bessent and Trump's grand strategy, the idea of cutting off Chinese exports to all of our other trade partners, could be successful. I think more likely than not. Like if they're able to come to the table in the next 90 days and get these deals hashed out, I lean toward them being successful because of this, because of these concerns over Chinese dumping on these markets. And that was what I kind of gleaned from comments from Bessent, was that the strategy was to ask these other countries to implement their own tariffs specifically on Chinese goods, even if they didn't import them necessarily right now, just to cut off those other avenues for China to export its way out of this.
Yeah, we've actually covered that a bit this week, specifically from France. France seems to be taking the lead on everything EU-wise. They are mirroring the de minimis taxes with the intent of bringing EU online in 2028. And we're covering here that they're participating in, actually breaking China's control over critical minerals coming out of Africa. That to me sounds like no matter what the EU is saying publicly to the American people, they're telling China through action, we are not siding with you.
Mm-hmm. All right, last question here. Trump has said, basically Trump went out and threatened the Chinese about buying Iranian oil, saying that they're going to put secondary sanctions on any country or any entity that buys Iranian oil. Jared, it seems like maximum pressure campaign, basically telling the Iranians, hey, let's negotiate a deal and let's make sure you don't develop a nuclear weapon, and maybe you can sell oil abroad without U.S. sanctions. Maybe that's a gracious look. The other thing is, you don't want China buying oil. And so maybe this is one of those things where it's a lot more stick than it is carrot. And there's no intention of actually feeding the donkey the carrot. You just want to beat him with a stick. I don't know. What say you?
So I've been tracking that pretty closely. I actually haven't even reported on all the sanctions because it gets repetitive, but most of the time, State Department saying, yes, this is part of the maximum pressure campaign, just explicitly. They did sanction all the Chinese teapot factories, which we covered a couple of weeks ago. And as far as Iran reacting, they are reacting, but they're only reacting diplomatically, saying, hey, we condemn this. And then they turn around and they do the nuclear negotiations with this. So I think it's mostly a war of words coming from Iran, and they're not going to seriously react because they can't seriously react.
Mm. All right. Well, that looks like the last question here. Guys, this is going to do it for the morning briefing, but the show goes on over on the Early Warning Network app. It's on your smartphone. I don't use the smartphone app. I use the web app. I log in via my browser on my computer. And we have a huge network, literally thousands of people on the Early Warning Network app, sharing information throughout the day. We have these breakout rooms for states. So if you want to get a little more local in your information sharing, you can do that. Start your free 7-day trial at www.earlywarningnetwork.com. Just hit the subscribe button and join us. We'll be happy to have you. And you will be happy to have access to all the information that's being shared. I would just say this. It's a community. And so people make friends and they get to know each other on the app. But really people are sharing intelligence information. And I think those are two of the primary benefits also. Well, that's going to do it for the show. That's going to also do it for this week. We'll be back in your inbox on Monday morning, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.